Sarayim, good afternoon or good Erev Tov if you're in Israel, where our speaker, who even puts her name in Hebrew, I see Yosefa Fogel Wruble so you become real Israeli. Okay, very nice. I want to welcome her back. It's been a while since she last taught for us. And then in the heydays, or that's not the right word, but in the in the middle of Zoom, middle of COVID, we were all at home and couldn't go anywhere. She's got a five-part series on Megillat Ruth, if I remember correctly. And no, I remember
I
this.
don't remember. I have no recollection.
Oh, you have no collection. You have no record. Okay. Well, we have to look in the archives. Baruch Hashem, we've had about 2,000 shiurim since March of 2020, really. So we can keep you busy for a couple of years just listening to shiurim 24/7. So it's a pleasure to welcome you back. Yosefa teaches at Migdal Oz and runs their podcast, and she has we spoke about it. We both now, I guess, have Parsha podcast. She runs the Matan Parsha podcast. She's a Yoetzet Halacha. It's a pleasure to have her. And I just want to thank Esther Cohen again, who's sponsoring a series of the Shiurim, our Pesach program in memory of her mother, Malka Krausman, Malka Bat Moshe Yitzchak, and Tema Michal. We should have happy occasions to come together and celebrate. Bakasha Yosefa.
Thank you. Well, actually, now I remembered. It was a series on Shir Shirim.
I was on Shir Shim, so
Yeah,
that's
I did
really
a
bad. I
series on
got it.
Shir
Why
Shirim.
did I
Okay, I'm
say
happy that
Ruth?
I
Okay.
that I
Oh,
remembered
yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah, 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 yeah. I have to go back and listen to 2000 Shiori. Okay.
Okay. No, that's
Okay.
okay. So it's a pleasure to be here. I see a whole bunch of familiar faces, which is great, and a whole host of new ones. So it's a pleasure to be here. And allow me to do the kind of thing that I love to do when I have the opportunity, which is to take a sort of motif that we see in Tanakh and kind of see different iterations of it and what it has to offer us. And this evening, I'll just share my slide. I'm just reiterating what Jay said before, that we don't have separate sheets for right now, but we have a PowerPoint. So give me 1 second. I'm just going to upload it. I'm sorry, I'm just going to share it and then we will begin. Okay, great. Hold on, let me make it bigger. Okay. So essentially what I want to do is to notice first that the idea of the oldest son comes up in a whole host of contexts, some of which I think are slightly more hidden than others. And I want to sort of assess the idea of the B'ni Bechori Yisrael. We'll see everything inside in a moment. I'm just sort of framing it for now. Why we're talking about this now? Why do we have several significant appearances of the idea of the eldest son? We'll see that we have the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben that kind of Kivyachol appears randomly of redeeming the firstborn son. We have the Makat Bekhorot, the 10th plague, which of course is going to afflict the eldest son. And we have, which we'll see inside, the fact that Hashem tells Moshe that he's going to tell Paro that B'ni Bechori Yisrael, that Am Yisrael is my eldest son, and this is why I'm going to save them. And the reason why this should be striking to us is because we've basically spent the whole book of Sefer Bereshit speaking or displaying the fact that being the Bekhor is not all that important. Okay, and allow me to sort of, jog your memory here, that here's just a nice, cute little list of all the stories in all the dynamics in the book of Breshit that really surround family dynamics, which is the vast majority of them. I sort of just classify them into different categories. We have marital relationships that are mentioned, sibling rivalries, and parent-child tensions. And I really just want to sort of spotlight the sibling rivalry topic, which I'm sure you've heard about in many different contexts. This is a very clear theme in the book of Breshit, all of our sibling rivalries that begin with Cain and Hevel. It's hinted to very clearly in Noah's sons, where he curses one of them and also claims that, one who's not the eldest is going to be the one who's going to be the leading. And that, of course, is Shem. And We have the tension between Abraham and Lot, and while they're sort of uncle and nephew, there's a very similar pattern that's there as well. And then we have the Yishmael Yitzchak, the Yaakov and Esav, Rachel and Leah is the female version of this pattern. Unlike the men who, when they sort of wage against one another, we're worried one will die. When it comes to Rachel and Leah, they wage against each other and they produce more children. It's a far better outcome. And then we of course have the last 13 prakim of the book of Breshit, and that's Yaakov's sons versus Yosef. And so we spend all this time, and we may come to the conclusion. Here I've just sort of brought it in the words of Rabbi Sachs, but please trust me when I say that all of the greatest thinkers have dealt with this question and tried to analyze, what's happening. And I'm just bringing Rabbi Sachs here for the sake of his clarity, but I actually want to take a slightly different turn than one of the things he says here. And he says the book of Genesis is, among other things, a set of variations on the theme of sibling rivalry. Okay, we have all of our lists. The book begins with fratricide and ends with reconciliation. He's claiming between Yosef and his brothers. There's a clear pattern to the final scene of each of the four narratives. Okay, and he claims that we have Cain and Hevel, there's murder. Yitzchak and Yishmael, at least they stand together at Avram's funeral. He thinks that there's a sort of a process here where they get better at these dynamics. Yaakov and Esav, they meet, they embrace, and they go their separate ways. And he claims that there's forgiveness, reconciliation, and coexistence with Yosef and his brothers. I think there's something slightly less forgiving than how it's being depicted here, but that would be a whole nother shiur on Yosef and his brothers. The word forgiveness doesn't appear anywhere in the book of Breshit. I don't think that's actually what they're after. They're simply after the coexistence, because even till their last moment, the brothers don't trust that Yosef really thinks that they're okay. They're worried that he's going to kill them when Yaakov dies. So they don't really have this process that we can today will consider, they spoke and they forgave and they, went through this therapeutic process. That doesn't seem at all to be the process that they go through, but they are able to live together. And then he comes to his theological conclusion, which is that in the development of these four narratives, the Torah is making a statement of the most fundamental kind. Historically and psychologically, families precede society and state. He says this also in his introduction. If brothers cannot live together in peace, then they cannot form a stable society or a cohesive nation. And so the claim is that before we can become a people, we have to first figure out how to become a family with each other. Okay, now this is all true and important. And therefore, it's very, very surprising when we see this theme continuing in the book of Shemot. Now, I have here a piece from, I think his first name is Jacob, but I'll just say Kaminsky is the last name. We'll see it, the name of the book in the second slide. But here he goes a step further in terms of why does the book of Bereshit sort of have this, this almost, I would say, kind of like obsession, like this very central motif of these warring brothers. And he comes to the following theological conclusion. And we're going to spend a lot of time today kind of in theological concepts. This commonly occurring trope is obviously making an important theological point, meaning the trope of the rivaling brothers. One element of this point is that God appears to favor individuals not favored by human convention. Now, here's what we get to, not about the rivalry between them, but why is that the case? Why is it the case that the eldest child is not the one who's going to take the helm? He seems not to be the right choice. Why is it that it's always the younger one who's going to take that position? One likely explanation for this unusual state of affairs, that God favors individuals and not the human convention of oldest is first is best, is that the Hebrew Bible, time and again, this is an academic speaking, reveals God's power by showing how human attempts to control outcomes are subtly subverted by God. Meaning, you think that your oldest child is going to take the family? Well, I'm going to show you that things are different. This recurring literary pattern might be labeled as the Bible's underdog motif. It shows up in many places in the Hebrew Bible, aside from stories of brotherly struggle. Thus, the prominence of several different women in the beginning of the Exodus story, that's our story, right, indicates that God frequently uses the powerless to overcome the powerful. The Bible enjoys stacking the deck against God's plan in order to highlight God's victories all the more, right? Isn't that even more unbelievable? We're going to take the underdog of society, and they're going to be the harbinger of the actual Geula. God gives all the advantages to those opposed to his plan, but his plan always prevails, frequently even by means of resistance to it, or through those who seem to be totally marginal and powerless. Okay, now here's the clincher. It seems that at least part of the stress on the underdog motif, particularly the way in which younger brothers supersede their elders by divine choice, is connected to Israel's sense of her late-born status. Rather than seeing this as an impediment to her divine election, as one would expect according to the rule of primogeniture, Israel views her late-born status as evidence of her worthiness to become God's chosen people. Let me put this into regular people's terms, okay? Now, when we look at the the rivalry between the brothers, many have mentioned and noticed that this is likely very much a part of the way Am Yisrael sees themselves. Meaning, we are that emerging younger child. There were many other nations on the scene, okay, and we come and surprise, surprise, we get God's covenant, and so many look at the book of Breshit and say this is really a precursor, or we can say it in all different kinds of ways, but it's kind of a precursor for how we're going to emerge on the scene of the world. And so it's not just a theme in Breshit, it's actually sort of cuts to the essence of who Am Yisrael is. Now, the next piece, which is incredibly important as well, and takes us right into the Mitzrayim story, is that another facet of these stories where the younger sibling comes to outshine the older brother is that in a number of them, the younger sibling who eventually triumphs is portrayed as a character who, at least for a time, is seriously flawed. Okay, again, I will translate this to slightly more, respectful language. Here one thinks of Jacob, Joseph, David, and Solomon, as well as possibly Isaac and Moshe. The emphasis of these stories on the upsetting of human expectations by noting God's mysterious election of the youngest child, even when he is flawed, must certainly reflect a deep-seated Israelite perception that the nation is blessed, but has not earned this blessedness primarily through merit, okay? The ability to sense one's chosenness and also to see one's character flaws is perhaps one of the greatest achievements of the Israelite religious mind, meaning of Tanakh. It creates a sense of ultimate meaning for one's nation, but it does so in ways that mitigate movement toward an unfettered imperialism and triumphalism. Okay, in our words, what does this mean? I actually think he writes beautifully, which is why I thought to bring in the original. But the idea being the following. I'm going to say it a little bit more toned down than how he does. In many of our stories where the younger becomes prominent over the elder, I would say at least we often don't really know why they're chosen. Okay. Take Yaakov, right? Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim doesn't let us know that there's something much better than Ish Tzait. Okay, we see Esav, he seems to respect his father. Obviously, there are stories after. We have the story of the Bekhorot, but in many of these narratives, it's not clear to us exactly why they're chosen. And then you might say, well, okay, Esav sold his Bekhorot, but then Yaakov went and stole the bracha. Okay, his mother told him to, but he went to go steal the bracha. And if you start stacking up sort of like the scorecard, it's not always a clear win on the side of the one who's chosen. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, well, I don't know, why were they chosen? Or you can ask it in a more, I would say, sort of neutral way. We meet Abraham, we know nothing about him, and God chooses him. God himself says in Brit Ben Abtarim that I'm choosing you because of what you're gonna do, not because of what you did do. Okay, the Midrash comes and fills in the backdrop because it doesn't really like the fact that Abraham is coming as a tabula rasa. But the Tanakh doesn't provide any of that. And so at least we know nothing about them. And at worst, possibly, they have already committed deeds that make us wonder why they're actually the chosen one. And so what he comes to the conclusion here, what his conclusion is that this is part of the way we come to perceive. It's not an answer, but it comes to be the way we perceive ourselves. That God chose us not because we were worth it. This underscores the midrash about Am Yisrael being on Memtet Sharei Tumah, that we were in the lowest, which isn't hinted to anywhere in the text, but we were on the lowest level of purity. That sort of supports this exact idea. God didn't choose us because we deserved it. God chose us because he wanted to and because of what we would do in the future, not because we were necessarily the obvious choice or the easy choice. Okay? This is a really, really deep point. The point he says at the end, which we can agree with or not agree with, because up until now, I think that to me, it really arises clearly from the stories themselves, is that if a person walks around with a humility of saying, I'm not, because if you're the chosen people, it could very easily become a source of gava. It could become a source of pride and hubris in the very negative sense. And so what is being pointed out here is that if we realize that our chosenness is rooted not in our worthiness and perhaps even in an unworthiness, but because of what we'll do with it, then we won't ever get to this place of sort of an imperialism. Oh, we're God's chosen people. We should rule the entire world. Now, thankfully, for Kaminsky here in this piece, he knows how history developed. We've never been an imperialist nation. That's never been our goal. And so it's exactly true. So he's sort of like retroactively going back and saying, that's interesting. How does a group of people like Am Yisrael not ever really strive for, more power than that? And he basically, in this place, sort of pulls out a theological idea. I think there's many other reasons. I think the Tanakh also says so many negative things about power. I think there's far more to say about the topic of why we never became an empire. Rabbi Sachs writes about how the fact that we are in a region that doesn't lend itself to empires, like meaning we ourselves, if we're just trying to be control of Eretz Yisrael, having an empire is quite a difficult thing to do. But here he's saying theologically that because our sense of self is rooted in we've been chosen because of what we're supposed to do, not because we're worthy, that kind of prevents us from going into sort of like an imperial mindset. I see people are commenting, but I saw in my instructions that I'm supposed to ignore them until the end of the class and then look at the comments. So I'm going to listen to those instructions and keep going forward, but there will be time for questions at the end, and I will look at all the comments. Okay, now what am I talking about the Egypt story? Why have I said that there's all these sort of, that's also all together introduction to see the book of Bereshit. What do we see in the book of Shmot? Okay, now here's where I hope that I'll sort of sharpen the lens on some elements that we didn't necessarily see before. Okay, so I've brought two sets of psukim, but they're all in they're all in a row. Okay, this is all being taken from Perek Dalid. Now I'm doubting myself if it's Gimel or Dalid, and I didn't write it, but I'll look at it after. Okay, so after Moshe receives his immediate instructions from Hashem, it says he has to go back to Egypt now to fulfill his life's mission. Vayikach Moshe, I'm at the top, the translation is underneath. Vayikach Moshe et ishto v'et banav vayarkivem al hamor vayashov arza Mitzrayim vayikach Moshe et mateh Elohim biyado. He goes back, right? He prepares his donkeys. They all go, him and his wife and his children. ויאמר השם אל משה, בלכתך לשוב מצרימה, ראה כל המופתים אשר שמתי בידיך ועשיתם לפני פרעה, ואני אחזק את ליבו ולא ישלח את העם. Right? He knows it's this what we call a spoiler. He knows the end before it begins. God says, and it's not the first time, he's telling him again, you're going to start, but it's not going to go well. Paro won't agree. ואמרת אל פרעה, כה אמר השם, בני בכורי ישראל. Okay, and here's where we have our first space, that he says, tell Paro, Am Yisrael, okay, is my firstborn son. Everybody puts the comma after Beni. Beni Bechor Yisrael, okay, my son. Yisrael is my ben Bechor. They flip the translation. Ve'omar elecha, shalach et beni v'yavdeni, v'tima'en לשולחו, הנה אנוכי הורג את בנך בכורך. And here immediately we have the first connection, okay, it's not, you don't have to read too deeply to see it, that he says that let them go, and if not, I will kill your firstborn. Okay, a clear midah keneged midah, and also telling us the end of the plague story. But we haven't even started the plagues. We're nowhere near starting the plagues. But we already know the end of the story. This is one of the many proofs that really shows us that the 10th plague kind of stands on its own, meaning it has its own status. It's part of its own element. But here, it's clearly meant to say, we're bringing out this metaphor of us being the firstborn, and if you don't let them out, I will kill your firstborn. Again, we will have to amend our translation of Bekhor if this is going to make any sense, okay? Because we've just said for so many significant stories that being the Bekhor is not what actually makes you, it's not about your birth order, but it's about being chosen. So it is much more accurate to read, Israel is my chosen son, okay? Stay with me for a moment. Let's see one more element. Hold on one second. Oh, okay. I'll continue it after. Here we have the comment of Radatz Hoffman, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, I would say about 200 years ago. He's in Germany. Omnam gam haya afshar levaer bitui zeh ben chaviv umuadaf. He says exactly what, right? I just said what he said. That you really have to translate this as my beloved and chosen son. Ve'ulam mekevan shelifnei matan Torah ne'amar ve'itam li segula mikol ha'amim ki li kol ha'aretz. Right? Because right before Matan Torah, we're told that we're chosen from all the others, i.e., we weren't the first ones born. We were just chosen. ואתם תהיו לי ממלכת כהנים וגוי קדוש. והרי שמשתמע כי רצון השם הוא לחנך את יתר בניו על ידי בן בכור זה. וכי על ישראל מותר להנהיג את האנושות כולה אל עבודתו יתברך. And so he says it doesn't mean eldest, it means leader child. You are going to be the leader, not because you're the oldest, you're not the first one on the scene, but because you have been chosen. And therefore, we learn that we are supposed to be these representatives and to actually teach the rest of the nations. Okay, so we've retranslated the word Bekhor. Leon Kass's commentary on these words, again, phenomenal commentaries for those who aren't familiar, highly recommend. Despite the Israelites' late arrival on the scene, right, they're hardly the world's firstborn nation, they are poised to become the treasured people, the prized national possession of the Lord of all the earth. They are chosen not because they are worthy or deserving, but even though they are heirs to God's covenant with Abraham, Israel can only become God's treasured people only through obedience, only if Israel hearkens to his voice and keeps his covenant, meaning it's also clausal, it's dependent. It's not a forever choice. And by the way, this leads to also the limitation of a metaphor. We'll get to this a little bit later, but as our children are not our children only if they behave nicely. They're our children no matter what. And so this already hints to the limitations of this metaphor, and we'll get to there. The parak continues with what also directly connects to this theme of the child, but we often overlook its connection. Right after that threat that Moshe is supposed to say to Paro, we have the most enigmatic story in all of Sefer Shemot, if not most of the Torah, where we read about this threat that happens to them on the way. Vayihi b'derech b'malon, vayifkeshehu Hashem, vayivakesh hamito. There's famously no subject. We don't know who it is, and the commentators say that it's either that on their way to their encampment, Hashem, it's a malach, some sort of emissary, tries to kill him. The commentators say either it's Moshe or it's his son. Those are our choices in the context. ותיקח ציפור הצור, ותכרות את עורלת בנה, ותגע לרגליו, ותאמר כי חתן דמים אתה לי. And Tzipora comes and saves the day, and she takes this, what will become later sort of a very special, it was known then also to have religious purposes, these stones, these flints, and they're also very, very sharp. And she knows that this is the problem. Okay, again, if we're not, our shiur is going broader than just this story. The support for that it really was their son who was being threatened is that perhaps he was being attacked in his groin area. If that's not the case and the attack was on Moshe, then it really was quite genius that she realized that the issue had something to do with their son. And also, please just notice that Tzipora really should be counted as part of the Nashim Tzidkaniyot that are part of the Mitzrayim story, because she saves either Moshe or her son in this story. I personally think she's saving Moshe, but she's saving Moshe or her son in this story. She's part of this group of women who sees the moment, who seizes and understands what to do before any of the men in the story, or quicker than the men in the story, and does what she needs to do in order to save life. So she's part of the exact same motif. Vayerech mimenu az amra Chatan damim lemulat. We're going to skip. It's a very interesting phrase, but we're going to skip that for right now. But there's some sort of status that he has achieved. And then the next pasuk says, Vayomer Hashem el Aaron, lech likrat Moshe hamidbara, vayelech vayifkeshehu bahar Elohim, vayishak lo. And the next pasuk, which then continues to the next unit, is that Hashem tells Aaron, please go to your brother, go meet him in the desert. And he goes, he meets him at the area of what will later become Har Sinai, and he kisses him. Now, why have I brought these psukim together? Notice the intensity of brotherly and family relations in the span of 8 psukim. We had B'ni Bechori Yisrael. We had the threat of Makat Bekhorot. Right after that, it's most likely a threat to Moshe's son, because up until now, we've only spoken about sons. And so there's a threat to Moshe's son. And this story very likely is a reflection of the fact that Moshe's Israelite identity is only now being solidified. Meaning, as he goes back to Egypt, his son needs to bear the mark of all those people there. To show up with a son who doesn't have a Brit Milah will make him a complete outsider, right? Moshe has a Brit Milah. He was born into an Israelite family. And so it seems that in the broader context of this story, Moshe's life is being threatened, okay? And it's because he hasn't committed fully in his family to being part of Am Yisrael. But if he's going back to be the representative, he's going to have to make that full commitment. And Tzipora, ironically, the non-Israelite woman, right? Part of the one of the many motifs that we're mentioning tonight, but the non-Israelite who knows what to do, like Rachav, just by way of example, in the book of Yoshua. But she knows what to do, and this solidifies their commitment or their membership in Am Yisrael. Now, right after, we have another family relationship. And here's where we have the final iteration of the younger brother outdoing the older brother. Okay, we have Aharon and Moshe. It's the exact same pattern we saw in the book of Breshit, but here there's absolutely no jealousy between them. Lehefech, right? He's sent out by God. He goes, he meets him, and he kisses him. Remember those kisses in the book of Breshit between the brothers, right? Kiss and make up. It's much more powerful than forgiveness and words sometimes. And so Aaron goes out to meet him. And so we see, and I'll just, in the words of the Midrash, it brings all these brotherly relations. And then it says, "Uke'eze ach amru Yisrael HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe ve'Aaron." Okay, it's a drasha on the phrase. One second. It's a drasha on the phrase from Shir Shirim. Yeah, on the shir it says, "Mi etencha ke'achli, keMoshe uke'Aaron. Imtzacha b'chutz ashakcha. I'll meet you outside and kiss you," says the psukim in Shir Shirim. It's about Moshe and Aaron kissing each other. Okay, the drasha here is definitely not about a romantic relationship, but it's about, are there any better brothers than that? Than Moshe and Aaron, where Moshe is the leader of the brothers, but Aaron also has a role. No one's being kicked out. It's not the stories of Breshit. Everybody gets their role, but yes, the younger is takes primacy over the older. And so we have this intense flow of stories about the brother, about the family relationship. Okay, in the Moshe and his son example, it's the father and son dynamic. But we have all this here. Now, what does this reflect? Okay, we saw up until now that this idea that it's not about being the eldest child, the Bekhor needs to be retranslated, but it's about the chosen one. Okay, two pieces I want to bring here. One is a continuation of the scholar that we saw earlier, and one is a different one. The sibling stories that we've spoken about until now is one that is begun by mysterious divine process, right? Meaning God chooses Hevel, he chooses Hevel's sacrifice. He chooses Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Yosef. But somehow this process is brought to fruition through the human resources of characters who react to the divine in appropriate ways, right? Meaning Avram passes the test. Yaakov offers Esav his blessing back in the form of a gift, and Yosef ultimately overcomes his estrangement from his brothers and saves their lives. So too, one finds texts like Dvarim, we'll see it soon, that election, meaning Bechira, originates in the mystery of God's love for Israel, and yet this relationship is fully realized only through obedience to God's laws given at Sinai. Okay, we mentioned this earlier, but I want to really sharpen it. This idea that the fact that Hashem chooses us, even though we didn't seem to deserve it in the opening story of Shmot, really fits with what we see in the book of Breshit. They don't seem to deserve it. But that's not the point. The point is that we have to sort of solidify that relationship by overcoming, right? Or by taking this process much further, by making ourselves the chosen ones. And in the case of Am Yisrael, we make ourselves worthy, or we fulfill that role by fulfilling the Torah itself. It's not enough just to be chosen as God's Ben Bekhor, but we have to actually fulfill the Torah. Okay. And the bottom says already what we said up until now, that it's not about our merit, but it's really about about the fact that God wanted to choose us, and because he had made this promise to the Avot. Vayishma Elohim, this is from the second chapter of Shmot. Vayishma Elohim et na'akatam, vayiskor Elohim et brito, et Avraham, et Yitzchak, et Yaakov. Okay, when Hashem hears our cry, he doesn't hear our cry because all of a sudden we became worthy. He hears our cry because he had made a promise to our forefathers, and now he was going to deliver on it. What happens in the future, that will be dependent on us. But actually getting chosen is not the part that's dependent on us, it seems. Okay. the psukim that were mentioned earlier, I want to look at them for a moment because they really bring home this idea very clearly. Where in the beginning of Dvarim that Moshe is speaking to Am Yisrael in his obviously his famous address, and he really underscores this same point. He says, "Ki am kadosh ata Hashem." This is like one of the famous passages of being chosen, okay, of our chosenness. כי עם קדוש אתה להשם אלוקיך, בך בחר השם אלוקיך להיות לו לעם סגולה מכל העמים אשר על פני האדמה. Okay? You are a holy nation, and God chose you to be his chosen people and his treasured people. לא מרובכם מכל העמים חשק השם בכם, ויבחר בכם כי אתם המעט מכל העמים. It's not because you were a lot of people, it's not because you were numerous, but actually you are the smallest of peoples. כי מאהבת השם אתכם ומשמרו את השבועה אשר נשבע לאבותיכם מוציא השם אתכם ביד חזקה ויבטחה מבית עבדים מיד פרעה מלך מצרים. It's because God had promises to our forefathers, and that's why he took you out of Egypt. וידעת, meaning almost in repay, וידעת כי השם אלוקיך הוא האלוקים האל הנאמן, שומר הברית והחסד לאוהביו ולשומרי מצוותיו לאלף דור. And what we have to realize is that we have to keep his covenant, and then we will make that choice the worthy one. It's not because we were worthy, but we will make the choice the correct one by actually fulfilling the Torah. Now, this theme of the first or the oldest or what we're redefining as chosen appears in they're all supposed to be in Perek Yud Bet in 12, but it got flipped, I see somehow. This is 12 too. This is okay, but we'll look at it anyways. We have in our really significant parak, which is Yud Bet, and then a bit more of Yud Gimel, which is where we really have like all of our stipulations, halachot surrounding the Yetziat Mitzrayim. And we have also here, I think, I want to notice the motif in its real intensity. I think we can see it, right, in three places. I'm going to start with the second two, because the first one I think is a bit more of a leap. So first we have ועברתי, it's in פרק י"ב, not פרק ב'. ועברתי בארץ מצרים בלילה הזה, והכיתי כל בכור בארץ מצרים מאדם ועד בהמה, וכל אלוהי מצרים אעשה שבטים אני השם. Okay? We have here again, Makat Bekhorot that is mentioned again. It's not the second time in the shir, it's because it's also the second time in the story. That we have the fact that Hashem says, I'm going to come to Egypt and I'm going to destroy all of the eldest sons. Now, again, in theory, we would have said, well, maybe God should have told Paro that he's actually going to destroy all of his second children, right? That, in theory, might have been most aligned with the alteration that God makes, quote unquote, on this motif of the eldest is the primary. But think about this for a second, that if you want to undermine the idea that your oldest is the prominent, then you kill the oldest, meaning the point is made dafka by highlighting the oldest child. It would be undermined because if the other children would be killed, then the first would remain prominent. So the makat of the firstborn is supporting this idea that the firstborn is not the one who's chosen. Here, I'm getting rid of Paro's firstborns. The second example, which is in the next parak, ויהי כי הקשה פרעה לשלחני ויהרוג השם כל בכור בארץ מצרים, מבכור אדם ועד בכור בהמה. על כן אני זובח להשם כל פת הרחם הזכרים וכל בכור בני אפדה. Okay, in the next parak, it recalls for the third time this 10th plague and says, because of that event, you have to be podeh, you have to redeem your firstborn child. Now, the question of what it means to redeem, we know what it looks like today, that we redeem it with the child with money. But in theory, what this was supposed to be is that the eldest is the one who works in the mikdash, meaning the eldest child becomes the one who sort of belongs to Hashem. Now, this is a little bit of a play on this motif, meaning it is saying, I'm going to take the older child and I'm going to take him for myself. Again, if it was completely in line with the motif, it should have said, I'm going to take, I think, the second child. But here, again, we have this idea as part of a whole series of mitzvot, where the beginnings of something we hand off to God, right? Whether it's our Reshit Hagiz, the shearings, our first fruits, etc. The idea that we never start something without giving a piece to God. So it's related to this idea of the Bekhor, but it's also related to, it's like doubly, it's part of like a Venn diagram. It's also related to this idea of giving the first to God in order to show that this doesn't belong to us. Now, I want to go back in time to the third element that plays off of this theme, which is החודש הזה לכם, ראש חודשים, ראשון הוא לכם לחודשי השנה. The parak famously opens with the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is declared to be on the first of Nisan. Now, famously, we have this debate kind of about, is the beginning of our year the first of Tishrei? Clearly, according to the Torah's count, that's month number 7. But what's interesting here, and I think it is a play on this theme, is that God almost is saying that, yeah, Tishrei was the beginning of the world's creation, but Nisan is the first month that I choose. And that is exactly the theme of Bekhor. Meaning, Bekhor doesn't mean first because Tishrei is actually first, but first means what I choose to be first. And I choose that you, Am Yisrael, should count your year according to when you became a nation, not according to when humans were born. Okay? I'm going to say that again because I think that this point really underscores this idea that even the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh and that we're starting to count the year on the first of Nisan underscores this same idea. It's not about the order, okay? Because in terms of creation, again, this is a question how you can actually say that Adam Arishon was really born in Tishrei, but there's so much of our rabbinic tradition that surrounds this question that there really are two options, just like there are two children to choose from. There are two options for how you can start your year. But God says, I choose Nisan to start. And it's exactly the same idea of I'm not choosing the first, I'm choosing the month that I want to for its potential. This is a month of potential for redemption. It's a month that signifies who you when you were created as a people. And in that regard, it really reflects this very similar idea. Okay, I want to look at one other significant piece, and this is about the idea kind of mixing metaphors. We could follow this motif of we could follow this motif of the chosen or the Bekhor. It's iterated in so many different ways throughout Tanakh. I do want to say that if this topic is of interest to anybody, there's a very long but very excellent course on the VBM website on the Yeshivat Har Etzion. Again, you could just type in VBM Torah, and it's a course by Professor Sam Liebens, who's wonderful. And he actually is right now it's in book form. It'll be published probably within a year. But he has a very long course on the topic of chosenness. He's a philosopher, so the course is written in much more philosophical terms, but it's really an amazing resource. And we could spend a long time following these ideas and the way that they're iterated in different books. But I actually just want to focus on one piece from the book of Yirmiyahu, okay? That the third parak in Yirmiyahu has we see the limits of some of these metaphors, okay? We've said up until now, just to recap, that it seems that the motif of us being chosen, even though we're not the oldest, quote unquote, or perhaps even the most deserving, we see this playing out in the individual lives of our forebears, and that it very possibly really sat at the root or at the essence of how Am Yisrael saw itself among the nations of the world. Now, Yirmiyahu has what to offer here. I'll also say that Yechezkel, Perek Tet Zayin, in which we quote from B'damai Chayi in the Seder, also has what to say on this topic. But there it does such an intense replaying of the concept that I decided to leave it on the side for now. We have in Yirmiyahu, in one perek, both the idea of us being God's lover and the idea of us being God's children. So just to read a few psukim, the beginning of Yirmiyahu Gimel really faults us for being utterly unfaithful to God, compares us to being a prostitute, that we, left ourselves for everybody, i.e., we worshiped all the gods of the other nations, and we we were not faithful to God. לאמור, הן ישלח איש את אשתו, והלכה מאיתו, והייתה לאיש אחר. הישוב אליה עוד, הלא חנוף תכנף הארץ ההיא, ואת זנית רעים רבים, ושוב אליי נאום השם. He asks a rhetorical question, and he says, if a man divorces his wife and she leaves him and gets married to another man, can he ever go back to her? He's not asking this halachically. The answer is actually halachically that's problematic, but he's asking it philosophically. Would not such a land be defiled? Okay. And he says, basically, this is like you, Am Yisrael. Now, in the case of a marriage, there may be one answer that may be clearer. Okay, I'm skipping to the end of that section. Achdei avonech ki b'Hashem Elokaich pashatata. Sorry, pashat. ותפזרי את דרכייך לזרים תחת כל עץ רענן, ובקולו לא שמעתם נאום השם. That you didn't listen to God, you communed with all the other gods, and you have transgressed against Hashem. Now, the fact is, though, is that while in a marriage the trust may be breached, we know that the answer to this rhetorical question is that, yes, God will forgive us. Meaning, Yirmiyahu doesn't come to say there's no way to do tshuva. He's saying in a regular marriage, would that ever fly? Would someone take their spouse back? But it's very different in the case of God and Israel, where God doesn't abandon us. In the next pasuk, he immediately moves to the child metaphor. שובו בנים שובבים נאום השם, כי אנוכי בעלתי בכם ולקחתי אתכם אחד מעיר ושניים ממשפחה והבאתי אתכם ציון. And he says, come back to be my children of Zion. I will take you from all the places you have scattered to, and I will bring you back. Now, why switch metaphors? Now, you could just say it's a different prophecy, but either way, the fact that these metaphors are juxtaposed next to each other actually really highlights something very significant. And here, I want to bring you the words of Sam. Okay. Sam says as follows. He says, biblical metaphors depicting the relationship between Israel and God are limited. That's why the Bible reaches for multiple metaphors. Something about God's passion for Israel and the commitments that they make to each other is best described by the metaphor of marriage. Moreover, our backsliding within this metaphor is powerfully recast as marital infidelity. That image beautifully captures something of the moral severity of our unfaithfulness to God, okay? Meaning it lets us know how horrible it is what we've done. When you worship other gods, you don't see God, so you don't feel so bad. But by recasting it through the eyes of unfaithfulness, like a spouse, it feels much more viscerally worse because we can relate to it. But unlike, and here I'm in the bold, but unlike the legal institution of marriage between two human beings, the relationship between God and Israel can never be wholly severed. There may be times when one party, namely the people of Israel, will be derelict in fulfilling the role they have been called upon to play, but there is always a route back. The calling is eternal, even when we fail to live up to it. To capture that element of the relationship, the metaphor of marriage is inapt. Another metaphor in which God is Israel's father and Israel is his firstborn then moves to center stage. Okay, meaning he says we need the second metaphor because the metaphor of a relationship with God is problematic. Secondly, we learn from this chapter of Yirmiyahu that if we insist on sticking with the metaphor of marriage, then the marriage between God and Israel is governed by a different law and logic than the marriage between humans. Comparing us to an unfaithful wife, the chapter begins with a rhetorical question: can the Jews return to God? But in contrast to a human marriage, the resounding answer of this chapter is yes, they can. Okay? Now, to connect this with our thoughts up until this point is the idea that we have these metaphors and they're unbelievably powerful, right? Meaning we start with the stories themselves of the brothers, of the overcoming, of the younger being primary over the older. And then it immediately becomes also a metaphor in the story of Am Yisrael in Mitzrayim. That we, vis-a-vis Mitzrayim, we are the younger child who is chosen. And we get called the Bekhor, again, not because of our birth order, but because it means to livchor. It's not the same root, but it's homophonically sounds the same. That we are the ones who are chosen, even though we are not the eldest. There's something very powerful about the fact that we didn't necessarily merit that choice, but that we have to live up to that choice. And that's what we will do in, hopefully try to, in the rest of the Torah, and obviously from that moment onward. And so this theme or this motif gets developed. Again, we see it being used here in Yirmiyahu, but when it uses the idea of us being God's spouse, which is another central metaphor, it then switches into being God's children, because each of these metaphors have their downsides. Depicting us as God's children depicts us as utterly dependent. It depicts us as having less agency than we would if we were God's spouse, right? There's an intimacy that is hinted to in depicting us as God's spouse that we can't get when we are God's children. It's not the same kind of closeness. And so later on in, also subtly in the Torah, but definitely in prophetic language, they start playing with these metaphors in order to sort of touch at the kind of emotional tenor that they want to capture and revive in our relationship with Hashem. Now, to sort of close this journey that we've taken through the idea of this metaphor, picking it up from the early story of Bnei Bekhor Yisrael to seeing the Moshe and his son and Tzipporah as part of this same relationship, and then seeing the relationship between Moshe and Aharon as being the almost perfected brotherly relationship where each of them find their place, even though the younger is taking the helm over the older. And then seeing the mitzvah of the chosen beginning of the year and the Pidyon of the Bekhor, I think very movingly, we have sons that come up again in our Haggadah, right? We have the Arba'a Banim. We have this, I think movingly, it's not two sons, right? If it was going to be an utterly biblical theme, then we would have Shnei Banim. But the Haggadah, of course, formulated much later and basing itself on the fact that there are 4 times where the Torah says to us that our child will ask us about our Egypt experience. And from there, it creates this tefillah, this whatever we'll call it, this text, where we have 4 different kinds of sons asking questions. But if for a moment I put this text that we'll read so soon up against what we've seen up until now, what's interesting is that within Am Yisrael, we're recognizing a real need for plurality, meaning we don't want to remain in this dynamic of the son who is in competition with the other son. In theory, by the way, if you read, right, Keneged Arba Banim Dibra Torah, Achad Chacham, Achad Rasha, V'Achad Tam, V'Achad Shoneh Yodea Lish'ol, we have what seems like a dichotomy of 2, right? The wise and the wicked, or the wise and whatever, however we're gonna translate him. And then we have the simple and the one who doesn't know how to ask. I think intuitively, very often, we do compare the first 2 because I think, again, very often within family structures, the first 2 children do often get compared to each other, and then the others come and they kind of like fill in the spaces in between them. There seems to be something much more that the Chacham and the Rasha are sort of playing off of each other, also in the text itself. And the Tam and the Shenoda, they show, well, they're these other children. But I really want us to notice that this does not have just a Chacham and a Rasha. If it did, it will be a highly biblical text, meaning in its theme. But it has all 4. And I think there's something very, very moving about the fact that we have these 4 sons, that we're leaving space for. It's not that one is going to be primary over the other. We do, though, have the same idea of the child who removes himself, of the child who, it's not, right? Also the phrasing. If in the biblical version of what this could look like, it's Hashem removes him from it, okay? But here we have that the son himself removes him, meaning this recognition that there kind of will often in a family structure be somebody who kind of is pulling back. But I still want to focus on the fact that there are 4 of them, that we've moved away from this, either or, but that we have a table with 4 sons and ways to respond to all 4 of them. And so, at least within the Jewish conception of how our table is going to look, we're not continuing forward this theme of chosenness, which of course has its difficulties in the way it meets reality, but we have a table that has space for everybody. And I guess it's with that I sort of wanna leave, and I'm happy to take any questions. but we've sort of traveled along with this theme. We've traveled along with this theme of the Ben HaBechor that we've continually overturned in the book of Reshit. And it seems that the book of Shemot takes it and continues to keep shifting it. The Ben Bekhor becomes this chosen son. We have all of these moments that sort of dance around this idea of the child. And very beautifully, as we continue on, we see that at least within the prophetic literature, we use that metaphor as well, but we also recognize its limits, not only in terms of that it creates tension within families, but that also as a way to describe a relationship with God, it has tremendous limits. And movingly in the Haggadah, we have this idea that they're not two, they're not a dichotomy, but we have room for many more. And I would say there's almost like a maturing of this theme. Again, I'm not saying that in like a derogatory way, but there's a shifting and developing of this theme over time in a sense that like once there is this moment of chosenness, we need to then make very healthy space for everybody at our table and Bezrat Hashem this year, of course, at our Seder table. So I'm happy. I'm going to look at the chat right now and see if there's anything that I feel that we didn't address. And I'm happy if anybody wants to unmute. Can you unmute? I'm not sure. And I'm happy to ask questions. I'm sorry, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, are we talking about diversity? The dirty word diversity.
So I don't think at all that the Tanakh is going towards a space of diversity, but I am suggesting that simply vis-a-vis the reality of the text of our Abanim. Yes, I do think so. I think that there's a very beautiful point being made here that this is an evening where we are hopefully every evening, yeah, but this is a prototypical evening where we're recognizing the need that we have different children with different needs. Again, the world today is moving to a space where we recognize that all the time. But that their educational needs are going to be different, and that's very important. I'm playing off of the idea of sons, but I do not think that that is the message coming through in the Torah.
And the other thing is, do you think that there's a word play between Bachur with a kaf and a chat, or is that a coincidence?
So I think it's really interesting. I haven't really seen anybody write about it. Again, it sounds similar, but the roots are not the same. So I haven't seen anybody really try and prove that. And I think I have to dig a little bit deeper into the root itself to see if that can be proven. But I haven't seen anyone until this point that's actually said that. And I think I would have seen that if there was greater grammatical basis for the claim. So I'll leave it
I
for
have seen someone make that claim, but not for this forum, but because it doesn't fit the sort of academic style of the way we're talking in terms of can you
right.
really make the interchange? But I have seen a serious scholar make that claim in a serious fashion when
Mhm.
talking about Makat Bekhorot and Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Okay, interesting. I'd love to see that. You're welcome to send it to me. I'd love to see that. Thank you. Other thoughts, questions? Okay, I'm happy I was so clear. Um, wishing everybody a Chag Sameach. And I'll say one other piece, actually, if anyone who's still here. I'll say one other piece, which is that the the flip side of the child metaphor is the fact that the birth metaphor in the Egypt story is unbelievably powerful. Both obviously the physical births and the fact that midwives and the women are so prominent in the story, that is undoubtedly our first element of that. But also the chronicling of Moshe's birth, meaning of noting the development of Moshe as our leader. It parallels the development of Am Yisrael in this time. And there's also a very powerful image, whether we often think about it or not. But Am Yisrael is physically born, while while the blood on the doorpost is definitely also a nod to making our house like a Beit Mikdash. There also is a whole group of people coming out of a small pathway that goes through a body of water and then comes out on the other side dry. This is been noted by many as being a very clear birth idea. And for some that might be moving, for some that might make them feel gross. As a woman, I think that it's actually moving. And I also think it just sits deeply at the root of what's actually happening here, meaning it kind of presents Mitzrayim as the womb. Where we take form, it's also the womb where Moshe takes form. And so there's a deep psychology and I think just truth here to the fact that it's in Mitzrayim that we also get chosen as God's son. And it's there we emerge from, and from there we'll be birthed, and from there we'll continue to develop in the stories that come after. So I'll leave you with that for now and wish everybody a Chag Sameach.
There's a repetition of the birth canal when they, not through water, but across the river when they enter the land.
Certainly.
So it's double there. But your motif about the divorce and whether you're a wife or a child, I mean, if you're dealing with halachic Judaism, especially biblical ones, a male child has more agency than a divorced woman. Because a woman who's aguna has no agency in biblical Judaism. And even today we know the troubles with it. So even an underage male child has far more agency than a woman, far more power. It's just, unfortunately, those are the facts, whether we like it or not.
I guess fortunate for us, our halachic life has developed, and I think that it's good to know when to separate a motif or the beginning of a legal development and then where it went in the future. Meaning, in reality, that's not the case, right? Meaning, in halachic reality as it stands, that's not true. I agree with you that to a certain degree in Tanakh world realities, that's the case. But as it stands right now, it's not. And it's also, always good to know when a metaphor is a metaphor and when things progress further.
Do any
True.
of the Meforshim suggest that the prohibition of remarrying a divorced wife only exists if you've remarried yourself? Do any Meforshim suggest that rationale is the same as Yirmiyahu's rationale?
Sorry, is the rationale for not being able to remarry a woman who you divorced and remarried somebody else? Is that your question?
Yes.
That's a great question. I don't know, because I haven't looked up those halachot in depth. I do not know if maybe it's brought later in the Gemara. I don't actually know. I haven't looked at those
Because
sugiyot.
you are
It's
like,
not in the pasuk in the Torah. What?
because you can remarry your wife if you haven't had another.
Correct. I think it sounds like, right? Meaning, again, that's how the halacha appears later in the Torah. It sounds like there is something deep about its value that's going on there. But I would be very surprised if it's kind of a chicken and an egg, meaning we don't generally make legal stipulations based on metaphoric ideas. It doesn't usually go that way. Ideas are usually concrete and then become metaphor, just like we saw that first we have the actual stories of the brothers and then it becomes a metaphor. That's generally how words and concepts work. So I would be very surprised if it went in that direction because you might say maybe this is the idea that is the precursor for that, but I don't think that it's necessarily the reason for it. I think that there probably has to do with a whole host of cultural norms that probably sat at the root of that, but I don't know because I haven't looked into it in depth, so I'd have to check it out. And I'm perfectly happy if you want to send me an email. I'm perfectly happy to look deeper in it and let you know what I find.
And could I'm Gershon Hepner, if you can tell me that.
I see, Gershon.
I want to know, my wife worked under a Mrs. Wruble in Skirball High School in Los Angeles. Is that a mishpacha of yours, Mrs. Wruble? No.
No,
Okay, good.
sorry. I mean, also it's my husband's last name, but no, it's not.
Oh, I'm glad about that because she wasn't a very nice person.
I'm happy I had the right answer. Uh,
I love what you say about Rosh Chodesh Nissan be reflecting this thing.
For the record, I loved it also. I thought about that in preparing this class. That was a fun thought.
Who's the first person who made that Chiddush? Do you know?
So far I know Yosefa Wruble. I didn't see it anywhere else.
Well, then it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Except
Yeah, I
There
had
was
that thought.
the only problem with it is that there's nothing in the Torah that makes it.
Agreed. You are absolutely correct there, Sean. That is the weakness of the theory. It's a great theory when it comes to rabbinic literature. You are absolutely correct. Yeah, the only thing that might support it, like in Tanakh wise, is simply the idea that it had to be given now, meaning it's very unlikely that there was no such thing as the beginning of the month up until the we're leaving Mitzrayim. And so we could say, oh, well, they're now being all the ideas we know. They're being given time. They have agency over their time. Ayin Sham, Rav Hirsch, v'chule. We could go there, but what I think supports the idea biblically is that it's impossible that they didn't have a concept of time until now. And so I likely think that it's recasting their sense of time. If anybody says this, by the way, it's going to be Kasuto, and I did not check him on that pasuk. I just shared the thought as it was, but I'm going to check, meaning in general, he speaks about how the entire parak is a recasting of ideas that they knew already from the ancient world, including a korban that was brought in the springtime, etc. It's
You
a
might say that the flood story reflects the the,
hmm,
the
interesting.
and as you and use that as a proof for the creation of the world.
Yes, that's good because there you're saying it's the time that it's counting
Right.
is from that. Oh, that's excellent. Okay, I'm gonna look that up. That's a great point. I really appreciate that.
Fantastic Torah that you gave, if I may say so.
Thank you. Anyone else have any other questions before we end? Yes,
have
Asher.
Have you considered there's one other very important story about chosenness and choosing, and that's
Mhm.
the story of Moshe Rabbeinu himself at the burning bush. When you
Mhm.
read it, in a sense, it's a very peculiar story in terms of how it unfolds. Uh, God,
Meaning that God chooses him, yeah?
God chooses him, but only when he turns aside to look at this sight that he's seeing,
Mhm.
where there's there's something that appears to be burning, but a dry bush in the desert, if it's actually burning, in a matter of minutes, if not seconds, is reduced to a teeny tiny pile of ash, and there's nothing there. And
Where do you see the choosing in the story? Meaning I see that God chooses him. It's the Moshe story in generally in Perek Bet there, sorry, Gimel, is
because,
usually understood as part of the choosing the leader story. Like, we have a whole host of stories like that.
but they've been no, but it seems the way the story unfolds, there's the language of God seeing that Moshe turned aside to investigate this physical phenomena, and if you look at the language carefully, it seems that if he if he hadn't specifically turned aside to look, he just sort of passed on by, he would never, that's the end of the story. It's only when God sees how he behaves in relationship. He's a shepherd. He's got a flock of sheep. It's only when God
And
sees.
so that, wait, I'm sorry, that proves his worthiness, you're trying to say? I don't see it as part of the same profile. The Moshe story is part of the profile of the surprise prophecy, the surprise revelation that comes upon the unassuming person, put in Amos, again, famously, it's most comparable to Yirmiyahu, of sort of this, mantle of leadership that then they want to refuse. It really shares many more motifs with the like inauguration prophecy stories, I think, it's true. You're right. Part of that is being chosen. You're totally correct. But in terms of he's not in comparison. He's not getting chosen over somebody else at the moment. It's not that piece of I'm choosing you as opposed to somebody else. Right? I think it's just a
Right.
slightly, I think it's a different motif.
I'm okay. I'm not. I don't quite agree because I think
Okay.
that the way the language of the first few psukim of that encounter unfold are kind of peculiar. They're not. It's. I mean, there's disagreement about who's talking to who when, but in my humble opinion, the malach is not God, and God is not the malach. It is only when Moshe reacts to the situation that God starts to speak to him. The malach, it mentions the malach, but a malach only has one job. What was the job of the malach? In my opinion, the malach was the fire. That was the fire. The rest is panim al panim, God directly to Moshe. And it's somehow the nature of the manner in which Moshe reacted to this physical phenomena was that which, as it were, caused God to choose him.
Okay. And I do. I think that there is a choosing here. I agree with you. He's choosing Moshe to be his leader, but um, and no, I think that is the case. I think that that story, though, it shares a lot of commonalities with the specific choosing of leader, which is different than choosing of one over the other. I'm just gonna ask because I see on the chat something very weird. May I suggest that the public besmirching of someone by name on this class should be removed from the recording? I have no idea what anyone's talking about. I publicly besmirched somebody? No idea.
No, somebody's name was mentioned in the course of the conversation. You didn't publicly besmirch somebody, but somebody's name was raised and during the course of the conversation, and the person writing in the chat.
In the comment. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I got it. Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure I didn't say anything. I'm like, I didn't agree with Orbe Sachs, but I didn't besmirch his name. Okay, I got it. I got the example. Okay, fabulous. I'm gonna wish everybody a Chag Sameach and wonderful to learn with you. I always love these classes. I love your feedback and hearing your questions, and it's really a pleasure. And I wish everyone a wonderful rest of Pesach preparation, both ruchanit and fizit. And it's great to be here.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Yosefa, thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Special regards to Zevi.
Oh, yes, I
Richie
see.
Alman.
Yes, besimcha. I'll send them. Yes. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.